is a DJ on The Current, and she hosts the Local Show, which you guys should listen to if you like local music. Do you already listen? It's Sunday nights at what time? 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock? Or 9? 6 to 8. And we met through music, and it wasn't Prince. We met through other music, and we became friends. And I'm so happy for her that she wrote this book. She's studied for how long? 4 years? 5 years? 4 years. It took her 4 years to write this book. So we talked about doing the work, right? We're talking about that. She's been doing it, and then pretty soon she's going to be doing the work of having a baby. Coming to Prince Academy in 13 years, maybe?
I hope so.
That would be cool. But anyway, she's here to talk to us about the Minneapolis Sound and about Prince.
Yeah.
Andrea.
Hey guys, you having a good week so far?
Yeah.
This seems like a really, really cool camp.
Mm-hmm.
What have you done so far?
We wrote parts of songs.
Yep. Cool. Original, so you're writing your own music? Wow, that's awesome. I don't think I even knew that you could do that for many more years beyond where you are. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what you can find in my book, but I think something that's really interesting is that I was thinking about the history that is covered in my book as it relates to Prince. The book kind of ends with Prince coming up in Minneapolis and starting his first band and playing some of his first shows. And it starts about 30 years before that. So I was thinking about, okay, how does that relate to you guys? Well, we're going to cover a period of history that kind of predates Prince in the same way that his history predates you. So I think it's really important to understand where you come from in your music community, and I hope that some of this history will help you feel more connected to the history of this place and all the great music that's come out of here, and also inspire you because there's been some amazing, amazing talented people that have come out of this city, and you're part of that. So I think that's really, really cool. So we're going to talk a lot about Prince as a kid and Prince as a teenager and some of the things that he would have been exposed to and some of the music that was coming out right before he grew up. So my book, as I mentioned, is focused around Prince, but covers a huge gamut of artists beyond that. But my curiosity really, really started and ended with Prince. With my work, I cover Minnesota music, so I've learned a lot about Prince over the years. He's obviously a huge figure here in town. And as soon as I started writing about Minnesota music, I realized I needed to become an expert in all things Prince in order to sound informed about talking about all the other music that exists here. So one of the things that I noticed right away was that people tend to talk about Prince kind of like he's an alien or like he isn't of this earth. Like he's so gifted and he's so unique in the way that he approaches his art, and he was a bit eccentric in the way that he lived his life, and people tend to talk about him like he isn't really of any kind of place or community. And that always really bothered me because I knew from living here and going out to chant dances and dancing with people like Heidi out at Paisley Park that Prince was very deeply rooted in this place, that he really loved the Twin Cities, he loved Minneapolis, he was really proud to be from Minnesota, and he was very much a product of where he was from. So this picture is from Prince making his television debut on, have you guys heard of this show, American Bandstand? Hi, Dan. So American Bandstand was kind of like the American Idol of the 70s, I guess you could say. It was where musicians went to have this big moment where they were going to be on national TV, they'd get to perform, people would tune in from around the country, and it could really be this huge launch pad for your career. Do you guys know who Dick Clark is? Mm-hmm.
It's the guy that does the
Yep. So he was the host of American Bandstand for many, many years, and he was the first person to interview Prince on national television. Back when Prince was, this would have been 1979, so Prince was 21. So Dick Clark comes up to Prince after they had finished playing their first song, and the first thing out of Dick Clark's mouth is, "This isn't the kind of music that comes out of Minneapolis." And this was Prince's response. He gives him kind of a side eye because Prince knew that, yes, this actually was the kind of music that came out of Minneapolis, that people were playing funk music and pop music and this dance music, and that there was music here that was deeply rooted in the specifically African American community in North Minneapolis. But if you didn't live here, and even if you didn't live in North Minneapolis, you might not have known that that kind of music was already being made. Prince was really the person to bring that to the surface. So that's kind of where my curiosity started. Okay, so most people think that Prince is this total anomaly, this oddball, that he just emerged out of nowhere, that he just happened to like this kind of music, but that's actually not true. So I started digging back, and I started going back in time and learning about some of the bands that were coming up right before Prince did. So I started with the 1970s, which you can probably see from the fashion. This is a group called, well, they started as the Valdons, and then they became the Philadelphia Story. They were active in the early to mid 1970s. They made some really great recordings. And they played at a bar called The Flame, where Prince and his friends would go hang out sometimes. This is a band called Prophets of Peace, another funk band from the 1970s. So I started thinking, okay, these are bands I know Prince was exposed to. Let's go back a little earlier. I started learning about the soul scene in the 60s and learning about this really, really great underground scene where you kind of had to know about these specific clubs where this kind of music was being hosted. Here's another picture of a soul singer named Gwen Matthews from the 60s. And I got all the way back to this band called the Big M's, who came out in 1958 with what happens to be the very first R&B record to ever be made in the state of Minnesota. And if you know anything about Prince, you know that's also the year Prince was born. And I just thought that was so cool that this kind of music and this scene was really born at the exact same time as Prince. So here's a copy of the record, the Big M's, and I'll play you a little snippet so we can hear kind of what this music sounded like. The man in the picture is the person that actually captured the record. Oops.
Sorry.
I thought I did that. Is it going?
You want to play?
Yeah.
Okay.
Teenage bands at that time were covering kind of the pop hits of the day. But this band was really ahead of their time, and they decided to write their own music, and then they ended up recording this song. The man in the picture is the engineer that captured it in his basement, and he was 16 years old. So he lived in North Minneapolis. His name is David Hurst, and he was really into recording gear, and he begged his parents to get him a turntable that could actually cut records. So, you know, a turntable has a little needle that plays the record. Back in the 50s, you could actually buy one that had another arm on it that would cut a new record, so you could record your voice, or you could record songs off the radio, or if you were David Hurst and you figured all that stuff out, you could actually record bands. So he was having his classmates from North High School haul their gear down into his basement and cut these really, really raw records, and that's how he happened to capture this really early recording.
It was North High?
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, they were all from North High School. So the picture I showed you right before this is the three main members of the Big M's. The family of musicians was called the the Munsons. There's Walker, Buddy, and Lamar are pictured here, and then there are actually three other brothers that ended up playing in the band later on. They kind of cycled through as each one would graduate and then new ones would come in. And they ended up being the first, probably not the first R&B band, but the first one to actually get recorded. So that is just so cool to me. So to put this in context with where everything else was happening in the city, here's a map of what's called the near North Minneapolis neighborhood, which is kind of the pocket of North Minneapolis that is closest to downtown and Bryn Mawr.
Hey, that's where I live.
What's that?
That's where I live.
Oh, really?
Bryn Mawr.
Oh, wow. So you can see Plymouth Avenue is running through the middle of it, and then Penn Avenue is running up the side, so it's kind of the heart of the near North neighborhood. That's where David Hurst lived, just a few blocks north of Plymouth on Newton Avenue. And this is where Prince lived when he was about 1 year old. So there you have the birth of the R&B recording scene and the birth of Prince happening all in the year 1958, about 6 blocks from each other, which I think is really, really cool. So that kind of brings me back to what I was saying at the beginning, of people like to think about Prince like he's a space creature, but he's actually so deeply rooted in this place, and I think it's so important to remember, and that's something that Prince thought was really important too. This is a quote that he gave to Minnesota Monthly Magazine in the late 90s, and just kind of re-emphasizing that point of he's so informed by what was going on in the city, and that he not only was informed musically, but also in terms of race relations in the Twin Cities. He was very, very aware of how that affected his life. So I want to talk a little bit about that as well. Just to give you a little bit of background about Prince, he came from a very musical family. His dad was a piano player in a jazz band. His mom ended up singing in the band. That's how they met. And his dad's band was called the Prince Rogers Trio. And if you know Prince's full name, Prince Rogers Nelson, his dad gave him that name as kind of an homage to his musical career. And he really saw something in his son that he was going to have this future in music. So even from the moment he was born, he was being influenced by these people that came before him in the music community. This is a picture of Prince's 5th grade class. He went to, this is at John Hay Elementary, which no longer exists, but was in
There's
North
little Prince in the
Minneapolis.
front.
Yeah.
Can you see him?
You see him in the front, y'all? Looking off to the
No.
side.
The one that
The
looks
very
like
front.
he's too cool to be in a picture. And we'll
Far
just
left.
zoom in on
Yeah. I've never seen this picture before. That's crazy.
I actually found this from one of his classmates. Saved it, and of course, now a very big collector's item. Teacher's very proud to have this picture.
I know the teacher.
So around the time, this would have been, Prince would have been about 10 years old.
68.
Wait.
Yep.
Oh, cool.
In 5th grade. There was a lot going on in the Twin Cities in this era, and I'm sure you guys are aware that the late 60s was a big time for the civil rights movement in the United States. There were a lot of things happening in major cities across the country, including riots in like Detroit and LA. That got a lot of press attention, and that's actually something that was happening here as well on a little bit of a smaller scale, but it really deeply impacted the city and especially the neighborhood where Prince was living. It's something that Prince actually reflected on in his music. Here he equates it with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. being assassinated and the streets they started burning. I wasn't able to find a direct link between something happening in Minneapolis the night that Dr. King died and unrest, but there was unrest in the couple of years around that, so it might have blurred together in Prince's mind. He might have been thinking of something he saw on TV, or it might just be that this era was just filled with a lot of tension and unrest, so he was kind of reflecting on it in general. But the next line really gets me too, and we're going to talk about kind of the link between this. He says, education got so important. So the first time that unrest hit Minneapolis was in 1966. This is actually the front page of the newspaper the morning after, and you can see 600 guards mobilized to keep order in the city. So they actually rolled in the National Guard to try to control the crowds and to try to control the anger that was happening. And I came across this picture, and I thought it was so interesting. I was actually looking at, you know what a microfilm machine is?
Yeah.
It's very old school technology to look at newspapers, and I was looking at it on the microfilm, and it was kind of fuzzy, and I was like, what is this picture? I really, really want to know more about it. So I zoomed in on the little tagline underneath it. It says, teenagers gathered in front of the Way Community Center for a street dance. The dance, chaperoned by parents of neighborhood youths and Way officials, was described as jovial. And here's a better image I was able to track down of that street dance picture. So you have literally tanks rolling through Plymouth Avenue, if you remember that was kind of the main thoroughfare in North Minneapolis. And then these teenagers trying to have a party in the middle of it all. And this really piqued my curiosity of like, okay, what was going on this summer where there was all of this tension hanging in the air? So people were trying to celebrate and trying to bond over music and find something positive in the situation. What I ended up learning is that in the immediate aftermath of that first night of unrest in 1966, which happened on Plymouth Avenue, the community got together and said, we really need something positive. We need a space where people can gather in this community, get out their frustrations, and find some kind of positive outlet. And at the time, people were really upset about a variety of things that were happening, not just racism, but lack of jobs in the neighborhood, a lack of resources in the neighborhood. People literally weren't getting their garbage picked up. The parks were all a mess, and there was barely any place for kids to even go play. And all of this was kind of swirling into a perfect storm of people's frustrations that this African-American neighborhood was just being completely overlooked by the city. There were no resources. So they ended up taking over this building on Plymouth Avenue called The Way. This is a little bit of a later picture when they changed their name to The New Way, but it started as The Way. And The Way was a place where you could go to, if you were a teenager or someone in your early 20s, you could go find a job there. They had a job bank where people were answering phones and trying to link you up with opportunities in the city. If you were maybe 10 or 11 and just wanted to have an activity, they had something called Sweep the Streets, where you could go and in exchange for going out and literally like cleaning up the street with a broom, they would give you a chance to play ping pong or pool or basketball or all these fun kind of recreational activities that they had there. And they had an amazing music program. So this is actually a band playing right outside The Way. A few years after the building had opened, this band is called Cohesion. And The Way became a place where you could go hang out, and people had donated instruments, and there was a room in The Way that was just kind of a jam hangout area where you could go pick up a guitar or pick up a bass or sit down at the drums and start playing for the first time and really figure out if that's something that you wanted to do. And through that, they developed this kind of house band. So I'm going to play a little snippet of this one. So this band is called The Family. They originally were called Back to Black. And they formed in the early 70s in The Way. And they ended up being kind of the big brothers of this whole new generation of musicians that was growing up in this neighborhood.
She was so fine.
Where's the phone?
She had so much to show me.
There. Where's the phone? All right. Lydia?
She pulled me by the coat. And she said, he said, what you doing? They said, he said, what you doing?
So let's talk a little bit about who's on that recording. So that was recorded in 1975. The band had been going for a little while. The lead singer was Sonny Thompson, who we now know as Sonny T, who went on to play with Prince in the New Power Generation and just become a legendary bass player here in the Twin Cities. And the keyboard player is Pierre Lewis. He now tours with the Commodores. He ended up recording some really amazing music in that era with this band and his own band. And the guitar player and backup vocalist on that track is Prince. So these guys, as I mentioned, were kind of the big brothers of this new generation that's coming up in North Minneapolis. And Prince was among these young kids. So that unrest happened when he was about 10. By the time the musical program got developed at The Way and this band had formed, Prince would have been about 14. And it was the perfect time to dive into this whole world of other musicians that were really excited to make cool new art. Here's a picture of Sonny. When I talked to Sonny about this and talked to some of Prince's peers of this era, everyone looked up to Sonny. He was like their god. there was a memory Sonny had of he was at home practicing one day. He lived just a couple blocks from the way, and he was just sitting and playing guitar or bass or something on his bed, and he looked up, and Prince and Prince's best friend Andrea Swensson were actually in the window well outside his window with their little faces pressed in, like, trying to look at him and feel like, wow, he's so talented. So they just adored him, and he was a little bit older than them, so he's kind of like a big bro. When I talked to, do you guys know Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, the two producers? So they live in Los Angeles now, but also came out of this same time and place. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis went on to work with Janet Jackson and Boyz II Men and all these really amazing R&B legends. And I talked to them about this band, The Family, and they said, yeah, we all looked up to them, and not only did we think that they were awesome, we were actually terrified of them because they were so talented, and we knew that they could just kind of play us off the stage. So this is Terry back in the 70s, Terry Lewis. Terry had a band as well that was called Flight Time. And Flight Time is a name that would come up again and again. That was actually what Jimmy and Terry would call their studio later when they opened it in the 80s. But back in the 70s, it was this really great band. And Cynthia Johnson is the vocalist here. And this was happening all around the same time that The Family was also playing and Prince was starting to play.
I feel so good, man. Whenever you're around, yes I am.
Don't know
what you do. What you do. I think I found the love and the stars above. I'll be blind for a beautiful love. You're close to me, girl. And you see.
That sounds like
Just come around me, little girl.
He was about 15, 16 when he was in this band. Everyone else in the band was in their late 20s.
Wow.
But he was so gifted that he was already arranging all the music and singing, and he just was like way ahead of time. So that gives you a little representation of kind of the music that was happening around the time that Prince formed his first band. Here's a picture of what Prince would look like around this era. He's in the middle. That is his 10th grade picture.
P. Nelson.
P. Nelson, yep. And then here's his 8th grade picture. I know, he's got the little baby cheeks. So the reason I wanted to point out this one is because this is about how old Prince was when he formed his first band, if you can believe it.
Wow.
So Prince hooked up with a musician at his school. When he was in junior high, he met a young man named Andre Anderson, who now goes by the name Andre Simone. Here's a picture of Andre playing at South High School in South Minneapolis with their band that they were in. I believe this was of the era when Prince and Andre were in this band together, so if you can believe it, whoever took this picture for the yearbook forgot to capture Prince. Just got Andre, and that's Andre's sister Linda playing keyboards. So this is a really, really cool snapshot of Grand Central, they were called. So at the time, they met in junior high. They started playing together, Prince and Andre. Andre told me this great story about they met at school. They kind of saw something in eeach other right away and went and stood next to each other on literally the very first day of school and struck up a conversation. And Andre said to Prince, hey, what do you do? And Prince said, I play music. And Andre said, I do too. So Prince said, why don't you come to my house after school and we'll jam? And this is when they would have been about 12 years old. And they went to Prince's dad's apartment. As we know, Prince's dad was a musician, so he had lots of instruments at his house. He had a piano, he had guitars, he had a little acoustic bass. And Prince and Andre sat down and started playing together for the first time. And Andre realized that there was a photograph on Prince's dad's piano. And remember this picture I showed you? So that's Prince's dad all the way to the left. All the way to the right, something that Andre realized is that's his dad.
Wow.
And their two dads were in a band together like 20 years before they ever thought to meet and start jamming. I told Andre I thought that meant that they were predestined and there was some kind of cosmic alignment happening. And he told me I was corny. He thinks it's a small neighborhood and that's just kind of the thing that happened in North Minneapolis. This is one of the only existing photos of Prince's band, of the full lineup of the band. So Andre's sister, Linda, was one of the keyboard players, and then she's standing right next to Andre. Next to Andre is Morris Day. Next to Morris is a percussion player named Terry Jackson, who actually lived next door to Andre. Prince, and then William Hollywood Doty is on the end there. Andre just told me a story not too long ago about how they all were getting ready to have this picture taken. It was like a really big deal to have a picture of the band taken. And Prince told everyone to go get their hair cut and get their afros nice and tight. And he kept his big. So they all showed up to get the picture, and Andre was like, wait a minute. We all cut our hair, and now you're going to stand out with your really cool big afro. So just to take it back to that map that we were talking about, I just wanted to show you a little bit about this neighborhood and how it was developing. So we talked about the first R&B recording that happened in 1958. We talked about where Prince would have lived when he was just 1 year old. This is where Jimmy Jam was recording that song that we heard in the basement of a house just around the corner from where that first R&B recording happened. This is where Andre lived. Prince would actually end up living at Andre's house from age 16 to age 18 after he'd run away from his own home. This is where the Way was, kind of right in the middle, right on Plymouth Avenue, and that's where they would all kind of hang out and go jam. This is another community center that was hosting a lot of the showcases at the time, so Prince's band and Terry and Jimmy's band and the family, they would all play these kind of Battle of the Bands showcases right over there at the Phyllis Wheatley Center. And that's where Prince's dad lived. So it's all, again, we haven't left this like 6-block radius of Plymouth and Penn Avenue, and I just think it's so fascinating that it was all just in this really small area that this was all developed. So just taking a little bit to the end of this, where I cover in the book, not the end of the story by any means, but kind of where the Minneapolis sound starts to kind of congeal and form and take off. Prince, after high school, ended up signing to Warner Brothers Records, which was a huge deal at that time for a teenager. And he ended up negotiating a deal where he got to produce his album himself, which is a huge gamble for some, a gigantic label like Warner Brothers to take on a basically untested artist. But he showed them that he could go in the studio and play every instrument and actually record a full song just alone. And they were very mesmerized and captivated by him. And they said, okay, we're going to give you a chance. We're going to let you record your first album. So he ended up recording, his first album came out in 1978. It's called For You. And he started recording basically an album a year in the beginning of his career. And he did have a little bit of success on especially the, what was called the black charts back then, we would call them like the urban charts. where he would have a single that would get played on certain radio stations, but he hadn't quite experienced that crossover hit yet. So he's kind of considered like this underground but still major label artist. But around that time, you remember Cynthia Johnson from Flight Time? This huge hit came out of Minneapolis called Funky Town. You guys know this song?
Where's the phone?
This started as a hit that Prince was experiencing, where it was on the black charts, it was on the disco charts, it was on the R&B charts, but then pretty soon it was on dance charts, and then it was on the Hot 100, and then it was a #1 hit, not just in the US, but starting global. And it became this like runaway success out of Minneapolis. And meanwhile, Prince is sitting there going, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be the runaway success coming out of Minneapolis. I'm the one signed to a major label, what is going on? So Lips Inc., the band that recorded Funky Town with Cynthia Johnson singing lead, was actually, the band was run by a man named Stephen Greenberg, who is a Jewish man that grew up in St. Louis Park, just over the border from North Minneapolis.
Wait, who's from St. Louis Park?
Oh! And this is where things get very interesting. So Stephen had this hit on his hands, and they knew that they wanted to push it and get it on MTV and get it in all these major markets. So when they played locally, they put Cynthia out in front. But when they made the music video for Funky Town, this is who was singing.
Oh,
my
goodness.
Stop.
A random girl.
Was she anybody?
I don't know.
Was she?
She was just
We don't know who
No, she was a robot.
I want to see that video now.
Can we not watch it?
I've never seen it either.
No.
I remember that because I remember being confused.
Yeah.
Because I remember being very confused.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So, as I mentioned, at that time there were separate charts for black and white music, and it was very difficult if you were an African American artist to make that leap to actually get onto the Billboard Hot 100 charts. And Lip Sync kind of knew what they needed to do to position themselves and push over that. And Prince was very, very aware of this and kind of incensed by it and kind of motivated by it, but out of like spite and anger, that kind of really good motivation that sometimes you need to really do something that you need to do. So this is what Prince told Warner Brothers around the time that this was all happening. And again, he was very, very in control of not just, wanting to produce himself and play all the instruments himself, but also how he was going to be presented to the world. So he said, don't make me black, I make music for all people. He specifically did not want to be marketed as an R&B artist, which was kind of a loaded word at that time. He wanted to be a pop artist. And he started thinking about, okay, how am I going to break through and break out of my neighborhood and break into this mainstream market? And something that became very important to him was getting into this building. You might recognize this building. It's not called Sam's anymore. It's called First Avenue. But back in 1980, it was called Sam's. And this was the cool place to play if you were in like a punk band or rock band, kind of the hip new wave sounds that were coming out in that era. Here's a picture of the schedule in 1981.
The Paddock.
So you can see Husker Du is on here.
Wow.
This is Husker Du playing in the 7th Street entry. The Replacements were also a huge band of this era. And this was a total incubator, cool scene where people were getting really excited about this new wave of music that was coming up in Minneapolis. And Prince knew that he needed to get in there. So in March of 1981, Prince played his first gig at First Avenue, still called Sam's at that point. This is a picture of him playing. I have a little clip of him playing that picture.
Yeah, Pete works there.
in front of a mostly white audience that was used to seeing mostly white punk bands, and he blew their minds because they hadn't seen anything like this before, and they weren't even really aware that this whole other community existed just over the border out of downtown in North Minneapolis. So that's kind of the argument that I make in my book, is that when you study the Minneapolis sound, it's music, obviously. It's thinking about all those different genres and styles that come together. But it's also kind of tearing down those walls between communities that existed in that time and still exist now. And really trying to find something that unites a lot of different people together. And I think that's something that's so amazing about Prince and so inspiring to me. So that's kind of the end of my little talk.
Thank you.
It was interesting. Definitely feel free to ask a lot of questions, and if you want to ask about this or anything, yes.
For like the Andrew and how he like run away, is there a reason why he ran away?
That's a great question. So Prince's parents divorced when he was young. His dad left his home when he was 7, and his mom remarried when he was 10. And I think he just kind of felt like he didn't really fit anywhere. So he, as we know, was very creative and very free-spirited, and I think he really wanted to see what it felt like to be on his own and to kind of push back against this instability at home and find something, a new place where he could fit in. So finding Andre, I think, was really, really important for Prince, because that was someone that he connected with so deeply musically and on a personal level. And then when he was looking for a new place to live, Andre's mom ended up becoming kind of a parental figure to him too. And her name was Bernadette. She was really active in the community, and she really helped Prince to stay in school. She said, you can live here and you can do whatever you want to do in the basement. You and Andre can jam and listen to records and stuff, but you have to go to school. And she gets a lot of credit for kind of keeping him on the straight and narrow, at least until he graduated, and letting him have that space to be creative but also be disciplined. So yeah, that's kind of how that all happened.
So like the buildings, like the way and all, are they still like up?
I wish. So the really wild thing about the way is that it was torn down in the early 80s, and the exact address and location of the way is now the 4th Precinct Police Station. So it's a totally different vibe.
What about the other buildings? Like I know the Sam's
Yes.
is still up there.
Yes,
well, like,
it is.
it's different, but what about the other buildings? Like what you were talking about, like all around North Minneapolis?
That's a great question. So a lot of the clubs don't exist anymore that they would have been going to, hanging out at, but the homes do.
Okay.
So you can actually see Andre's home is on the National Historic Registry, not even because of the Prince connection, but because of the architecture of the home. So we know it's always going to be there. It's going to be safe and preserved. Some of Prince's childhood homes are still there. One of the first one that I pointed out when he was just a baby is gone.
Okay.
But the other ones are still there. The Capri Theater, where Prince made his live debut, even before Sam's, he made his first real show as a solo artist with his band back in 1979, was at the Capri, and that's still there, and it's actually being restored right now, so we know that'll be around for many years, which is good.
Yeah.
You can take, I think people offer tours even now. In the last couple of years, there's been so much history, research, and interest in this topic. You can actually take like a Prince North Minneapolis tour, so keep an eye out for that, because it's super interesting to go see just how close together everything is. And
It's so weird how I lived here all my life. I go around North Minneapolis like, a lot. I've never known about any of this stuff.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It
Just
is
like
crazy.
right there.
Right.
I go to North Commons a lot.
Yeah.
And they're just like all around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think just very recently, and unfortunately, I think partly because of Prince's passing, people are realizing like we need to learn about this now, and we need to document it and pass it along to the future generations so they know about all this history. So I think there's going to be a lot more work in the years to come to kind of get people up to speed. Yeah.
Just to make sure, I was like really confused. But like, is Prince like mixed or like black and white?
He's black.
He just like.
He confused that issue himself. When he gave his first few interviews as he was kind of emerging as a national artist, he gave an interview in Rolling Stone where he said his mom was Italian and that he was of mixed race, but his parents were both black. So we don't know why he said that.
Well,
And also his parents in Purple Rain, the movie, the fictional characters, one is black and one is white. So people thought that that was his ethnicity, but he was actually, yeah, I think it was maybe a way to kind of toy with people's expectations of him, to kind of put that out as his narrative. Good question.
Are you gonna name your baby Prince?
I don't know.
Is it girl? No, you don't know. You don't know.
We don't know. Yeah. We don't know what's going to happen.
Andrea, just to give you some context, before you came, I showed them some videos of artists that Prince was probably listening to around 68, 69.
Oh, cool.
So they saw a little bit of James Brown and Sly Stone and Joni Mitchell. Joni Mitchell was the one that they knew least about, and that was the main influence. Would you mind just talking a little bit about why you think he gravitated toward her or music? Because it's so very different than the stuff that he, is most famous for.
Absolutely. Yeah, so Joni, you guys listen to a little bit of the music?
A little bit, yeah.
You know a little bit about what it sounds like. I think of her almost as like a jazz artist with the way that she composes her music. She gets described as like a folk rock artist because she wrote really beautiful lyrics. But the chords that she used in her music are very impressionistic and very rooted in jazz theory. And I believe that because Prince was around all this jazz music growing up and hearing his dad play the piano, that he just had a really open ear for that kind of music. And I think that he was really drawn to all these beautiful colors that she was making in her songs. And that's something that he would talk about again and again, that he thought kind of the perfect mixture of music was taking like the James Brown funk shuffle, like really hard driving beat, and combining it with these really cool colors that Joni Mitchell was exploring in her chords and putting together this kind of like almost indescribable progression of sounds. And that's something that he definitely was exploring as his music progressed. In the beginning it was definitely kind of out of this funk scene and combining rock as well. But if you listen to the progression of his music through his records, he really got into playing more piano and bringing in all of these really cool like world music elements and exploring kind of these different tapestries of sound that you can explore as you bring in like strings and all these other elements too. So I think that's kind of where that influence came in, and I think he was really just so progressive in that way that he could pick out these seemingly like totally opposite genres of music and say these need to go together. Like I want to see what happens when they go together. But he talked about Joni like throughout his whole life. And the last time I saw him perform, which was just at the beginning of 2016, and he was doing the piano show. It was just him alone at the piano. He actually covered one of her songs, and it was so beautiful. It was a song that he loved of hers called A Case of You. And it's something that he played many, many times over the years. So you can just see how, he just kept returning to that well and was so inspired by her.
Thank you. We're learning so much. Us grown-ups are learning so much too.
You guys have other questions? If you want to, if you have questions about the current or working in radio, and I could talk about a lot of different stuff. So anything that's on your mind. Yeah.
What was the experience learning about Prince? Like things you haven't like learned and stuff. Like what was the experience?
Something that I've realized is that it's so interesting that I can just keep learning about him probably for the rest of my life. Like it's something that I thought, especially after he died, and that was such a difficult time, and I thought, okay, maybe I'm kind of getting to the end of my exploration of Prince, and maybe I'll kind of move forward now. But it just keeps pulling me back in because there's all these different things to learn about, and not just his music and all of his amazing recordings that both have been released and are going to be released in the future, but also all the people that he worked with and how their lives were touched by him and enhanced by him, and how he drew out all this excellence from the people around him. the way that he impacted the city, building Paisley Park here and having it be a place where musicians would come in from around the world to record, and really staying rooted in Minneapolis. I mean, if you've made a list of just all the people that performed some random job for Prince over the years that still live in the Twin Cities, it'd be hundreds of thousands of people that got hired to shoot music videos or to work at his club that he had downtown, or he just was really about kind of funneling that back into the city. So I just keep learning more and more and more, and I can't stop. So I think I'm just going to be a Prince scholar for the rest of my life. Yeah.
What's your favorite part about Prince?
Oh boy. I think my favorite part about learning about him as an artist is that he never stopped changing. He, from album to album, it would be so different. And with the people that he wanted to work with and the sounds he was exploring and instruments he was learning, he was just constantly evolving. And that's something that I think about a lot in my own work and the way I approach my life too. I don't want to do the same thing year after year. I want to always be a new person and to explore new things. So that's really inspiring to me. And then I was very lucky to be able to spend a little bit of time with him. And my favorite part about that is just he was a really, really sweet man and funny and just kind of a delight to be around. So I feel happy that I was able to experience that too.
What's your favorite Prince song?
I think my go-to is a song called The Beautiful Ones. Do you know that one?
Oh, yeah.
I think that kind of captures everything I love about him. It's so dramatic and beautiful, and the lyrics are beautiful, but then his vocal delivery is like insane. He goes from he starts out singing, and by the end he's screaming, and in Purple Rain he's rolling around on the ground, and it's just amazing. I think that would be one of the top ones.
Let's have lunch, everybody. Yay, food.
Yay, food.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's in 5 minutes. Lunch is in 5 minutes.
Wow.
Okay.